English title. My daughter-in-law kept poisoning my tea to make me sick. She didn't know I'd been swapping her cups with mine for weeks. Vietnamese title. Con dao tua lin ti si bodak veo trata keen tua by om. No kong beat rang tua de treo kak qua no voi kak qua tua sit nu tuan lin. The wail of a siren was the first thing that broke the evening's suffocating silence. It grew from a distant cry to a piercing scream that clawed at the historic, wood-paneled walls of my home. But I remained still, standing by the grand fireplace, my hand resting on the cool marble of the mantelpiece. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened glass of a framed portrait, a woman I barely recognized, her face a mask of calm composure. On the floor, sprawled across the antique Persian rug, was Chloe. Her designer dress was twisted around her legs, and one of her ridiculously expensive heels had come off, lying forlornly on the polished oak. Her face, usually a picture of vibrant, calculated beauty, was a ghastly shade of pale, her lips tinged with blue. She wasn't moving. My son, Mark, was a whirlwind of panic beside her. His phone was pressed to his ear, his voice cracking as he relayed information to the 911 operator. Yes. She just collapsed. She hasn't been breathing right for days. I don't know. She fell. He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes wild with terror. He looked from his unmoving wife to me, his gaze pleading for an answer, an explanation, anything. I offered him none. My heart, which should have been breaking for him, felt like a cold, hard stone in my chest. The flashing red and blue lights painted strobing patterns across the living room, dancing over the family photographs, the shelves of leather-bound books, the life I had so carefully built. Then came the heavy thud of boots on the porch, the authoritative knock that didn't wait for an answer before the door swung open. 2 paramedics rushed in, their faces grim and professional. They knelt beside Chloe, their movements efficient and urgent. What happened? One of them asked, looking at Mark. I don't know. We were just talking. And she. Mark's voice trailed off into a sob. I pushed myself away from the mantelpiece. My joints ached. Familiar. Dull pain. But my steps were steady as I approached them. The paramedics looked up at me, their expressions a mixture of surprise and professional courtesy. I held out a small, clear plastic bag. Inside was a single strip of paper from a home testing kit, a faint but distinct line visible on its surface. Check her for this, I said. My voice was even, devoid of the emotion that was churning inside me. It was the voice of a historian stating a fact, not a mother-in-law watching her daughter-in-law die. It's digitalis. I believe you'll find what you're looking for. The lead paramedic took the bag, his eyes narrowing as he looked from the test strip to me, and then to Chloe on the floor. The air crackled with unspoken questions. Mark stared at me, his mouth agape, the dawning horror in his eyes more painful than any siren. The scene faded, the flashing lights melting into a soft, hazy glow. 3 months earlier, the autumn light in Concord, Massachusetts, has a quality all its own. It's a soft, golden light that filters through the changing leaves, making the entire town look like a faded, cherished photograph. My home, a colonial-era house that has been in my husband's family for generations, seemed to drink in that light. It settled on the wide plank floors, warmed the dark wood of the furniture, and illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, lazy fairies. Before Mark and Chloe came, my days were governed by a quiet, predictable rhythm. I would wake with the sun, drink my coffee while reading the paper, and spend my mornings in the garden if the weather was kind, or in my late husband Arthur's study if it was not. Arthur had been a professor of literature, and I, a professor of history. The house was our sanctuary, a fortress built of books and memories. Every corner held an echo of our life together: the worn armchair where he read poetry aloud, the window seat where I graded papers, The faint scent of his pipe tobacco that still clung to the velvet curtains, even years after he was gone. My life was solitary, but I was not lonely. I had my books, my memories, and the steadfast presence of the house itself. It was a life of peace. That peace was disrupted by a frantic phone call on a Tuesday. "Mom, you won't believe it," Mark had said, his voice tight with stress. "A pipe burst in the apartment building. Our whole floor is flooded. Everything is ruined." "Oh, Mark, are you and Chloe all right?" "We're fine, but we have nowhere to go. They're saying it could be months before the repairs are done. We're at a hotel right now, but..." He hesitated. I knew what was coming. "Don't be silly," I said, my maternal instincts overriding the quiet hum of warning in the back of my mind. "You'll come here. There's more than enough room." And so they arrived, with a few suitcases and a story of domestic disaster. Chloe, my daughter-in-law of 2 years, was the very picture of distraught grace. She was beautiful, in the way a porcelain doll is beautiful, flawless, delicate, and a little unnerving. She glided into my home, her eyes wide with feigned admiration. "Oh, Eleanor, it's even more magnificent than I remembered," she cooed, running a perfectly manicured finger over a mahogany sideboard. "You have such impeccable taste." Mark beamed, relieved. He was a good man. My son, an accomplished architect, smart and kind, but with a blind spot the size of Boston when it came to his wife. He saw her charm and took it for warmth. He saw her attentiveness and mistook it for love. Who had spent a lifetime studying the motivations behind human actions, saw the careful construction of a persona. But he was my son, and he was happy. So I held my tongue. I wanted to believe it, too. The first few weeks were an adjustment. The quiet of my house was replaced by the low murmur of the television, the scent of Chloe's expensive perfume, the general hum of 2 more people sharing my space. Chloe appointed herself my caretaker. Started with small things. She'd insist on cooking dinner, preparing elaborate meals I didn't have the appetite for. She'd rearrange the throw pillows on the sofa, a subtle but constant assertion of her presence. And then, she started the tea. "You look a little tired, Eleanor," she said one afternoon, her voice thick with manufactured concern. "I have this wonderful herbal blend. It's from a little artisanal shop in the city. It's supposed to be excellent for relaxation and heart health." She presented it to me in one of my own fine china teacups, the steam rising in a fragrant cloud. It was a thoughtful gesture, a kind gesture. I was a 72-year-old woman. After all, my heart wasn't what it used to be, and my energy waned more quickly each year. It was nice to be cared for. "Thank you, dear," I said, accepting the cup. "That's very sweet of you." "It's nothing," she smiled, a sweet, cloying smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We have to take care of you." The tea became a ritual. Every day, around 3 o'clock, Chloe would appear with a silver tray bearing 2 cups. One for me, one for her. We would sit in the living room, making polite conversation as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows. First, I enjoyed it. It felt domestic. It filled a space in my afternoon that had once been reserved for quiet reflection. But after the second week, I started to notice things. It began with a profound sense of fatigue that would wash over me an hour or so after my tea. It was more than just the gentle drowsiness of an afternoon nap. It was a heavy, leaden exhaustion that pulled at my limbs and clouded my thoughts. I chalked it up to age. Then came the nausea, faint, rolling queasiness that would come and go, leaving me feeling weak and unsettled. I blamed it on Chloe's rich cooking. The third symptom was the most alarming. Sometimes, while reading in the evening, I'd feel my heart give a strange flutter, a little stutter in its steady rhythm. It would beat too fast for a moment, then too slow. A dizzying frightening dance in my chest. I would place my hand over my heart, breathing deeply until it passed, a cold dread seeping into my bones. I finally made an appointment with Dr. Miller, my physician for over 20 years. I sat on the crinkly paper of the examination table, detailing my symptoms: the fatigue, the nausea, the heart palpitations. He listened patiently, nodding as he made notes. He ran a few tests and EKG, some basic blood work. The results all came back within the normal range for a woman of my age. "Eleanor," he said, his smile kind but dismissive, "you're 72. These things are to be expected. You're not as young as you used to be. The body slows down. Sometimes it hiccups. Your heart is strong, but it's an old heart." I felt a flash of indignation. "This feels different, David. This isn't just getting old." "Perhaps it's stress," he offered. "Having your son and his wife move in, even under the best of circumstances, is a big change to your routine." I left his office feeling foolish and unheard. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was just age and stress. Maybe I was becoming a hypochondriac, a silly old woman imagining ailments where there were none. That evening, as I sat in my chair, the teacup warm in my hands, I watched Chloe across the room. She was scrolling through her phone, a small, self-satisfied smile playing on her lips. She looked up and caught me watching her. "Is the tea all right, Eleanor?" she asked, her voice as smooth as cream. "It's lovely, dear," I said, forcing a smile. But as I took a sip, the aromatic steam filling my senses, cold, terrifying thought began to form. It was a seed of suspicion, planted in the fertile ground of my unease. I looked at the amber liquid in my cup, and then at the vibrant, healthy woman who prepared it for me every single day. The palpitations started again, a faint flutter of warning, and for the first time, I wondered if the kindness in my cup was a poison. The thought was so monstrous, so unthinkable, that I pushed it away immediately. But it didn't disappear. It took root. Over the next few days, I became an observer in my own home, a historian, researching a living subject. I paid attention to the details. Chloe always prepared the tea in the kitchen, alone. She always brought it out on the same silver tray, in the same matching porcelain cups. She always placed my cup on the coaster to my right, and hers to her left. The ritual was precise, unchanging. My symptoms grew more pronounced. A dizzy spell one morning almost sent me tumbling down the stairs. The world would occasionally seem blurry at the edges. Strange, yellowish tinge coloring my vision, which I dismissed as a trick of the light. I felt my own vitality seeping away. Day by day, cup by cup, I was getting weaker. And as I got weaker, Chloe seemed to glow with a brighter, more vibrant energy. She became even more attentive, fluffing my pillows, offering to read to me, her face a perfect mask of loving concern for the frail old woman I was rapidly becoming. Every act of kindness now felt like a turn of the screw. The seed of suspicion, once planted, grew into a suffocating vine, wrapping itself around my every thought. The house, once my sanctuary, now felt like a gilded cage. And Chloe, my keeper, was also my potential executioner. I began to live a double life. On the surface, I was Eleanor Vance, the frail, grateful mother-in-law, sinking deeper into the fog of old age. Inside, I was a detective, a spy in my own home, every sense honed to a razor's edge. I started a new habit. After our afternoon tea, I would excuse myself to the bathroom and force myself to vomit, my body convulsing over the cold porcelain of the toilet. It was a degrading, violent act, but it was a necessary one. I needed to purge the poison from my system before it could do more damage. I would splash cold water on my face, look at my pale, haggard reflection in the mirror, and practice the weak, weary smile I would wear when I re-entered the living room. My mind, the one part of me that Chloe's herbs couldn't seem to dull, raced. As a historian, I'd spent decades studying the dark underbelly of human nature, the power struggles, the betrayals, the quiet, patient poisons of medieval courts and Victorian households. I retreated to my husband's study, the one room Chloe rarely entered, under the pretense of needing to rest. Surrounded by my books, I began my research. I wasn't just looking for a poison. I was looking for Chloe's poison. It had to be something subtle, something whose effects mimicked natural decline. Arsenic was too crude, too famous. Cyanide, too fast. My fingers, trembling slightly, traced the spines of old toxicology texts and historical accounts of famous poisonings. And then I found it. A chapter on cardiac glycosides. Foxglove. Digitalis purpurea. A beautiful, bell-shaped flower that grew in gardens all over New England. It was known as a heart medication in small, carefully controlled doses, but in larger, cumulative amounts, it was a deadly poison. The symptoms listed on the page were a mirror of my own suffering: nausea, fatigue, vomiting, an erratic heartbeat, and a peculiar disturbance of vision, a yellow-green tint to the world. It was a poison that wouldn't show up in a standard autopsy. The death would be attributed to heart failure. Tidy, tragic, an entirely natural end for a woman of my age. The cold clarity of it was breathtaking. This wasn't a random act of malice. This was a plan. Meticulous, patient, cruel. Chloe wasn't just trying to kill me. She was trying to erase the very fact of her crime. Now I knew what to look for. All I needed was proof. The opportunity came 3 days later. It was a dreary, rainy afternoon. The mood in the house was as somber as the weather outside. Chloe entered the living room with the silver tray, the 2 teacups steaming invitingly. She placed it on the small table between our armchairs. "A nice hot cup of tea for a day like this," she said, her smile as bright and artificial as a plastic flower. "Thank you, dear," I murmured, my voice intentionally frail. She settled into her chair. As she reached for her own cup, I made my move. With a small, theatrical sigh, I leaned forward to pick up my own cup. My hand, which I allowed to tremble with a convincing weakness, slipped on the smooth, polished surface of the saucer. The cup tilted, sending a small wave of hot tea sloshing over the side, onto the saucer and the dark wood of the table. "Oh, goodness me," I cried, my voice a pitch-perfect imitation of an elderly woman's fluster. "How clumsy of me. I am so sorry. Chloe." "It's nothing, Eleanor. Don't worry about it," she said, though a flicker of annoyance crossed her face before being replaced by her usual mask of concern. She stood up. "Let me get a cloth. Don't you move." As soon as she left the room, I acted. My movements were no longer frail but swift and precise. I pulled a small, empty vial from the pocket of my cardigan, one that had once held my heart medication. I carefully tilted the saucer, letting the spilled tea pool and then run into the vial. It wasn't much, just a few precious milliliters, but it would be enough. I screwed the cap on tightly and slipped it back into my pocket, just as I heard her footsteps returning from the kitchen. When she came back, I was dabbing at the spill with my napkin, looking helpless and apologetic. She cleaned up the rest, her movements brisk. She didn't offer to make me a new cup of tea. Perhaps she didn't have any more of her special blend prepared. That night, I locked myself in the study and went online. It was surprisingly easy. A few clicks on a discreet laboratory website, an anonymous payment, and a home toxicology kit was on its way, promised to arrive in a sealed, unassuming package within 2 days. The next 48 hours were the longest of my life. I had to continue the charade. On the following day, I feigned a headache and refused tea. Chloe's smile tightened at the edges, but she said nothing. The day after that, the package arrived. It looked like any other online order. I took it up to my room, my heart hammering against my ribs with a rhythm that had nothing to do with any poison. With trembling hands, I followed the instructions, pipetting a tiny amount of the tea from my vial onto the test strip. And then I waited. The instructions said it would take 10 minutes. 10 minutes to confirm that my life had turned into a waking nightmare. 10 minutes to know for certain that the woman my son loved, the woman living under my roof, wanted me dead. I sat on the edge of my bed, the little plastic strip lying on my nightstand. I didn't look at it. I looked around my room, at the photographs on my dresser. A picture of me and Arthur on our wedding day. A picture of Mark as a little boy, grinning with a missing front tooth. The solid, tangible evidence of a life filled with love and trust. A life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. When the 10 minutes were up, I took a deep, shuddering breath and looked. There it was. A second pink line. Faint but distinct. Unmistakable. Positive for the presence of cardiac glycosides. The air rushed out of my lungs. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. A strange and terrible calm settled over me. It was the calm of a general seeing the enemy's battle plans laid out before them. It was a feeling of profound, chilling certainty. The world had not tilted. It had been revealed for what it was. My first thought was of Mark. My poor, foolish, trusting son. To tell him would be to destroy him. He would be forced to choose between his mother and his wife. And I knew, with a mother's painful certainty, that he would try to find an explanation, a way to believe in her innocence. He would be torn apart. My second thought was of the police. I pictured myself walking into the Concord police station. A 72-year-old woman, clutching a home test kit, accusing her beautiful, charming, and devoted daughter-in-law of attempted murder. Chloe would weep and deny it. She would talk about my episodes of confusion, my failing health. Mark, loyal and blinded by love, would reluctantly corroborate her story. I would be dismissed as senile, paranoid, a jealous mother-in-law. They would pat my hand, tell me to go home and rest, and Chloe would know that I was onto her. And then, she would simply become more creative. The next time, there would be no warning. No, the police were not an option. The world saw me as a weak, doddering old woman. Chloe was counting on that. My doctor was counting on that. Even my own son, in his loving, protective way, saw me as someone who needed to be cared for, not feared. And in that shared underestimation, I found my advantage. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the twilight descending upon my garden. The foxgloves were no longer in bloom, but I could picture them. Their tall, elegant spires of purple and white bells. So beautiful, so deadly. Chloe had started a war. Quiet, domestic war fought with teacups and whispers. She thought she was the only one fighting. She thought she was laying siege to a defenseless fortress. She was wrong. She had made one critical, fatal error. She had mistaken age for weakness. She had mistaken silence for submission. I would not be a footnote in a police report. I would not be a sad story told at my own funeral. A cautionary tale about the frailties of old age. I am Eleanor Vance. I am a historian. I have studied the fall of empires and the rise of tyrants. I understand strategy. I understand patience. And I would write the end to this chapter myself. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept soundly. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a survivor. And my plan for survival had just begun. The next day, the sun rose on a world that felt fundamentally different. The air in the house was still thick with deceit. But now, I could see it, taste it. I was no longer stumbling through a fog of confusion. I was navigating a battlefield where I knew the enemy's position and her weapon of choice. My fear had not vanished, but it had transmuted into something else. A cold, Hard resolve that settled deep in my bones. It felt like coming home to a part of myself I had long forgotten. My objective was simple, yet terrifyingly complex. I had to turn Chloe's weapon back on her. I had to do it so subtly, so flawlessly, that she would never suspect a thing until it was too late. My life was no longer the only one at stake. My credibility was. If I failed, if she even suspected, I would lose everything. That afternoon, at precisely 3 o'clock, I heard the familiar soft clinking of porcelain on silver as Chloe came down the hallway. I was in my usual armchair, a book open on my lap, my posture deliberately slumped to project an image of weary resignation. I had spent the morning practicing, studying my own reflection, learning how to make my hands tremble just so, how to let a vacant look glaze my eyes. I was becoming the actor my role required. She entered with her customary smile. Tea time, Eleanor. The silver tray was immaculate. The 2 teacups were identical, beautiful pieces of bone china with a delicate blue floral pattern. They sat on matching saucers, each with a small linen napkin folded beside it. It was a portrait of civility. I knew that one of those cups held chamomile tea. The other held chamomile tea laced with a carefully measured dose of digitalis, meant to push my aging heart one step closer to failure. She placed the tray on the table between us. As always, she positioned the cup meant for me on the coaster to my right. Her own cup sat on the left. It was a habit, an unconscious pattern of behavior, and I was going to use it against her. I had spent an hour planning this moment. I needed a distraction, something that felt natural, accidental, something that would focus her attention away from the cups for just a single, crucial second. It smells wonderful, dear, I said, my voice thin. But I wonder, would you be a darling and get me my shawl? There's a bit of a draft coming from the window. It was a perfect autumn day. Not a breath of wind. There was no draft. But it was the kind of request a frail old woman would make. Chloe's smile barely faltered. Of course, Eleanor. Anything for you. She turned and glided towards the hallway where my shawl was draped over a chair. Her back was to me. It was now or never. My heart pounded, a frantic bird against my ribs. My hands, which I had willed to tremble moments before, were now perfectly steady. I leaned forward. In one fluid, silent motion, I switched the positions of the 2 teacups on the tray. My cup was now on her side. Her cup, the poisoned one, was now on mine. I settled back into my chair, my book in my lap, my expression placid. Just as she turned back around, shawl in hand, the entire exchange had taken less than 2 seconds. To an outside observer, nothing had changed. Here you are, she said, draping the soft wool over my shoulders. Thank you, dear. You're so good to me, I replied, my voice filled with a gratitude that was entirely false. She sat down and picked up her cup, the cup that had been intended for me. She lifted it to her lips. I held my breath. My entire world seemed to shrink to that single moment, to the space between the porcelain rim and her mouth. I watched her over the top of my own cup, my eyes feigning weariness. I could see the slight curve of her smile as she prepared to take a sip. It was a smile of triumph, of a plan proceeding perfectly. She drank. It was just a small, polite sip, but it was enough. The poison was in her system now. A wave of something dark and powerful washed over minute guilt, but a chilling sense of victory. The game had begun in earnest. I lifted my own cup, the safe one, and took a long, slow swallow. The chamomile was warm and soothing. This is a lovely blend, Chloe, I said, my voice perfectly calm. Truly. I'm glad you like it, she said, taking another sip from her cup. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I watched her. I was looking for any sign, any flicker of a reaction. But there was nothing. Of course there was nothing. The poison was cumulative, slow-acting. She wouldn't feel it after one sip, just as I hadn't at first. She would simply believe that her own constitution was robust enough to handle the herbal blend she had prepared. The rest of the afternoon passed with excruciating slowness. I had to perform my own symptoms. About an hour later, I pressed a hand to my chest. "Oh, I murmured, letting out a soft breath. Chloe looked up from her magazine, her eyes sharp and attentive. "Are you all right, Eleanor?" "Just a little flutter," I said, waving a dismissive hand. "It passes. Old age is not for the faint of heart, is it?" She gave me a sympathetic look, but I could see the glint of satisfaction in her eyes. My performance was convincing her that the poison was working, that my decline was accelerating exactly as she had planned. Every feigned symptom of mine would mask the real symptoms that would soon begin in her. That night, sleep did not come easily. The adrenaline of the day had faded, leaving behind a cold, hard knot of reality. I had crossed a line. There was no going back. I was no longer just a victim defending herself. I was actively harming another human being. A monster, perhaps, but a monster of her own making. I lay in the dark, listening to the old house groan and settle around me, and I wondered if Arthur would still recognize the woman I had become. The thought was a sharp, painful sting, but I pushed it away. This was about survival. Morality was a luxury I could no longer afford. The next day, I repeated the maneuver. This time, my distraction was a book, accidentally knocked from the end table. As Chloe bent to pick it up, I made the switch. It was becoming easier. My movements more practiced. My conscience quieter. She drank the poison tea without a second thought. And I drank the pure tea, feeling its warmth spread through me like a small, secret victory. I began to keep a journal. A small, leather-bound notebook I hid inside a hollowed-out copy of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. I documented everything with the meticulous precision of a historian. October 12. Switched the cup successfully. Distraction. Requested my reading glasses from the study. Chloe drank without hesitation. I feigned a dizzy spell around 4:30 p.m. She seemed pleased. No visible symptoms in her yet. October 13th. Switched the cups. Distraction. A feigned coughing fit. It was very convincing. I reported feeling a deep-seated exhaustion. In truth, I feel more alert than I have in months. I am watching her closely. I thought I saw her rub her temples once, as if with a headache. A promising sign. My days became a strange tapestry woven from two realities. In one, I was the dying matriarch, my world shrinking to the confines of my armchair. I would speak of fading memories, of aches and pains, of the strange tricks my eyes were playing on me. I would sigh and look wistfully out the window, playing my part for my audience of one. Mark would call in the evenings, and I would let my voice sound weak and reedy, cutting the call short with the excuse of needing to rest. His worried tone was a knife in my heart, but it was a necessary wound. In my other reality, the secret one, I was a predator. I was sharp, focused, and alive with a terrible purpose. I noticed everything. The slight tremor in Chloe's hand as she applied her lipstick. The way she started taking deeper breaths, as if she couldn't quite get enough air. The subtle, almost imperceptible darkening of the circles under her eyes, which even her expensive concealer couldn't fully hide. One evening, about a week into my counteroffensive, Mark came home early from work. Chloe was in the kitchen, preparing one of her elaborate dinners. I was in the living room, reading. "How are you feeling, Mom?" he asked, kissing the top of my head. He looked tired, worried. "Oh, the usual," I said with a weak smile. "Some days are better than others. You seem a little better today, though. A bit more color in your cheeks." My heart leaped. I had to be more careful. A good nap, perhaps, does wonders. Chloe came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. Dinner's almost ready. She smiled at Mark, but it looked strained. I'm exhausted, she said, forcing a light laugh. I don't know what's wrong with me lately. I feel like I could sleep for a week. Mark put his arm around her. You're doing too much. Honey, taking care of Mom, running the house. It's a lot. Maybe you're the one who needs a special blend of tea. Chloe's face went rigid for a split second. I'm fine, she snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. She quickly softened it. Just a little run down. I'll be fine. She walked away, and Mark looked after her with a concerned frown. He turned back to me. She's been a little on edge lately. Not like herself. She is under a lot of pressure. Dear, I said, my voice dripping with false sympathy. We must be patient with her. He nodded, but the worry remained in his eyes. He was seeing the first cracks in her perfect facade. He just had no idea what was causing them. He thought it was stress. Concern for me. He had no idea he was watching a poisoner slowly, unwittingly, drink her own medicine. The irony was so bitter, so profound, it was almost poetic. The days bled into one another, each marked by the 3 o'clock ritual that had become the axis on which my world turned. My repertoire of distractions for switching the cups grew more inventive. One day, sudden, piercing sneeze. The next, a request for a different pillow to support my aching back. Another time, I simply forgot which cup was mine and reached for hers with a confused smile, forcing her to correct me and, in doing so, unknowingly seal her own fate for the day. Each successful switch was a small, sharp thrill, a private affirmation that I was still in control. I became a connoisseur of my own feigned decline. I learned how to let my hand shake just enough when lifting a fork to my mouth, how to let my breath catch when climbing the stairs. I spoke of the world looking dim and yellowed, using the very words from the toxicology textbook. I was building a case, brick by brick, not for a jury, but for Mark. When the time came, he had to believe that my mind was sharp, even as my body was failing. My performance of weakness was, ironically, a demonstration of my strength. Meanwhile, the poison was taking root in healthier soil. Chloe's body, younger and stronger than mine, fought back. But the daily, insidious dosing was a battle it was slowly losing. The changes were subtle at first, visible only to my watchful eyes. The vibrant bloom in her cheeks began to fade, replaced by a permanent, sallow undertone. She started wearing more makeup, applying foundation with a heavier hand to mask the pallor of her skin. She complained of headaches and a persistent, metallic taste in her mouth, which she blamed on a dozen different things: a new brand of toothpaste, the water in the old house, seasonal allergies. I would listen, my face a mask of sympathy. Oh, you poor dear. I would say, perhaps you should see a doctor. It's nothing, she would insist, her voice tight with an irritation she was trying to suppress. I'm just tired. Her patience, usually so boundless and smooth, began to fray at the edges. Small things would set her off. A dish dropped in the kitchen would elicit a string of muttered curses. A phone call from one of her interior design clients would end with her snapping the phone shut with unnecessary force. She was a tightly wound spring, and the poison was turning the screw. Mark was caught in the middle, his brow permanently furrowed with a helpless concern for the two women in his life. I don't know what to do, he confessed to me one evening, his voice low as Chloe showered upstairs. Mom, you seem to be getting weaker. And Chloe, she's just not herself. She's so irritable. She burst into tears yesterday because she couldn't find her car keys. It's the stress, Mark, I said, patting his hand. My touch was meant to be comforting, but my skin felt cold. It is an enormous burden. Caring for an invalid. I used the word deliberately. Invalid. It was what she wanted me to be. It was what she was becoming. I know. But. He sighed. A deep, weary sound. I told her maybe we should hire a nurse. Just for a few hours a day. To help you. To give her a break. And what did she say? I asked. My curiosity piqued. She refused. Adamantly. Said she wouldn't have a stranger in the house. That it was her duty to take care of you. He shook his head in bewildered admiration. She has such a good heart. I said nothing. Her good heart was a cage she had built for me. And now, for herself. A nurse would be a witness. A nurse would ask questions. A nurse might notice the strange, parallel decline of the patient and the caretaker. Chloe could not afford a witness. The first truly dramatic sign appeared about 3 weeks into my campaign. We were in the dining room. Chloe had insisted on making a roast. A grand, unnecessary gesture. She stood to carve the meat, the large knife gleaming under the chandelier. As she lifted a slice onto a plate, her hand wavered. The knife clattered onto the platter with a loud, jarring sound. She swayed on her feet, one hand flying to her forehead. Chloe! Mark exclaimed, jumping up from his chair. Are you all right? I'm fine. She breathed, her face deathly pale. I felt a little dizzy for a moment. The heat from the oven, I think. She clung to the back of the chair for support, her knuckles white. I watched her, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. I felt a cold detachment, the clinical interest of a scientist observing an experiment. The poison was working more quickly than I had anticipated. Sit down. Honey, Mark insisted, guiding her back to her seat. I'll serve the plates. She sank into her chair. Her eyes closed. She didn't eat a single bite of the meal she had so painstakingly prepared. She just pushed the food around her plate with her fork, her hand visibly trembling. Later that night, I heard them arguing. Their voices were muffled through the thick walls, but the tone was unmistakable. Mark's voice was pleading, full of concern. Chloe's was sharp, defensive. I pressed my ear to my bedroom door, straining to hear. See a doctor. Chloe, this isn't just being tired. Mark was saying. I told you. I'm fine. You're overreacting. You're treating me like I'm her. Her voice was laced with a venomous resentment. That's not fair. I'm worried about you. Well, stop worrying. Worry about your mother. She's the one who's sick. I'm just exhausted from trying to keep this entire house, and everyone in it, from falling apart. The sound of a door slamming shut ended the conversation. I stepped back from my door, thin, cruel smile touching my lips in the darkness. It was perfect. She was creating her own narrative of martyrdom, of a devoted daughter-in-law run ragged by the demands of caring for her ailing mother-in-law. It was a beautiful, tragic story, and it would make her own eventual collapse seem not only plausible, but poetically inevitable. She was digging her own grave and calling it a flower bed. The next afternoon, she came with the tea tray as usual, but her movements were slower, more deliberate. The mask of cheerful concern was still in place, but it was cracked, the despair showing through. I chose a simple distraction. I asked her to adjust the curtains, complaining that the sunlight was hurting my sensitive eyes. She walked to the window, her back to me. I made the switch. When she turned around, I saw that she was rubbing her stomach. Is something wrong, dear? I asked, my voice soft. My stomach has been bothering me all day, she admitted, a rare crack in her armor of perfection. It feels unsettled. Oh, you poor thing. It must be a stomach bug. There's one going around, I hear. I offered the lie with practiced ease. She picked up her to the poison tea. She looked at it for a long moment, her brow furrowed in thought. A wave of panic washed over me. Was she hesitating? Did she suspect? But then she lifted the cup to her lips and drank, her expression one of grim determination. Perhaps she thought the hot herbal tea would soothe her roiling stomach. The irony was a blade twisting in my gut. She was drinking the cause of her ailment as if it were the cure. As I sipped my own safety, I felt a shift within myself. The cold resolve had been my shield. But now, a darker feeling was stirring. It was a grim, terrible satisfaction. It was the feeling of justice being served, not by a court of law, but by my own hand. I was no longer just a survivor. I was an avenger. And I was discovering, to my own horror, that I was exceptionally good at it. The house began to feel like a pressure cooker. The air was thick with unspoken ailments and simmering resentments. My feigned frailty and Chloe's genuine sickness created a bizarre, symbiotic sickness that permeated every room. We were two actresses in a play of our own making. And the audience, Mark, was becoming increasingly distressed by the performance. He finally put his foot down. That's it, he announced one evening, after finding Chloe hunched over the kitchen sink, dry heaving. I'm making an appointment for you with Dr. Miller. And for you too, Mom. A joint checkup. I'm not taking no for an answer. Chloe, pale and sweating, straightened up. Don't be ridiculous, Mark. I don't need a doctor. It's just a stomach flu. A stomach flu that's lasted for weeks? He countered, his voice firm. A stomach flu that causes dizzy spells and heart palpitations? Because that's what you described to me last night. Funnily enough, those are the same symptoms Mom's been having. My blood ran cold. He had connected them. It was a logical, innocent connection, but a dangerous one. It's the stress, Chloe insisted, her voice rising with panic. I'm probably just having sympathy pains. It happens. Look it up. I'm not looking it up. I'm calling Dr. Miller tomorrow, Mark said, his jaw set. You're both going. I saw the terror in Chloe's eyes. A doctor's visit was a wild card, an unpredictable variable in her carefully controlled experiment. A blood test could reveal anything, but to refuse would be to arouse Mark's suspicion beyond repair. She was trapped. Fine, she spat, turning away. Do whatever you want. On the other hand, had to appear relieved. Oh, thank you, Mark, I said, my voice trembling with gratitude. Perhaps he'll finally be able to get to the bottom of this. I knew Dr. Miller would find nothing new with me. My old EKG had shown minor, age-appropriate irregularities, and my blood work was always normal. It was Chloe's results that would be the problem. The day of the appointment arrived. I sat in the waiting room next to Chloe. She was fidgeting, her fingers constantly twisting the handle of her expensive purse. She looked awful. Her skin had a waxy, unhealthy sheen, and her breathing was shallow. She was a portrait of anxiety. In contrast, projected an air of weary calm. Dr. Miller saw me first. The examination was a repeat of the last one. He listened to my heart, took my blood pressure, and asked the same questions. I gave him the same answers, perhaps adding a little more dramatic flair to my descriptions of fatigue and blurred vision. Well, Eleanor, he said, patting my hand in his familiar, condescending way. Everything seems stable, unchanged from your last visit. We'll run the blood work again, but I suspect it will tell us the same story. This is simply your new normal. When it was Chloe's turn, I waited. I could hear their muffled voices from the exam room. The consultation took much longer than mine. When she finally emerged, her face was a stony mask, but her eyes were wide with a fear she couldn't conceal. Mark was waiting with me, and he rushed to her side. What did he say? Mark asked. He said I'm exhausted. Chloe reported, her voice brittle. He thinks I might have a vitamin deficiency. He took some blood. He told me to rest. She refused to look at me. We drove home in a tense silence. The dynamic of the house had shifted. My feigned illness was now a documented medical fact of old age. Chloe, on the other hand, was a mystery, a collection of symptoms that had a doctor puzzled. The scales were beginning to tip. The very next day, thought struck me, cold and clear. Chloe's plan had relied on cumulative poisoning over time. But now she was sick, panicked, and perhaps getting desperate. What if she decided to accelerate the process? What if, in her fear and frustration that I was still alive, she decided to increase the dosage? The thought sent a jolt of pure terror through me. My game of switching cups was a delicate dance. It relied on the dosage being consistent, non-lethal in the short term. A significant increase would be dangerous for me if I made a mistake, and catastrophic for her if I didn't. My fears were realized that afternoon. When Chloe brought the tea, I noticed something different. The color was a shade darker, a deeper, more ominous amber. The aroma seemed sharper, more bitter beneath the scent of chamomile. She thought my senses were dulled by age. She was wrong. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was a new level of risk. I needed a more robust distraction than usual. As she set the tray down, I let out a small, sharp cry of pain. My leg, I gasped, clutching my thigh. A cramp. A terrible cramp. I writhed in my chair. My face contorted in a performance of agony. It was my most convincing work yet, fueled by genuine fear. Eleanor, Chloe cried, her own troubles momentarily forgotten. She rushed to my side. What is it? What can I do? Just help me stand. I panted. I need to stretch it out. She put her arm around my waist to help me up. Her touch was clammy. As she guided me to my feet, her body blocked her view of the table for a precious few seconds. With my free hand, hidden from her sight by the arm of the chair, I reached over and switched the cups. My fingers were slick with sweat, but my movements were sure. I leaned on her, taking a few hobbling steps. Oh, that's a little better. I sighed, gradually straightening up. It's passing. Thank you, dear. I'm so sorry to be such a bother. It's no bother, she said. Her voice strained. She helped me back to my chair. She looked shaken, her own pallor deepening. My feigned crisis had clearly rattled her frayed nerves. She sat down, her hands trembling slightly. She picked up her cup-me cup, the heavily dosed cup, and took a large, desperate gulp, as if trying to steady herself. I watched, my breath caught in my throat. I had just handed her a loaded gun, and she had willingly pulled the trigger on herself. A wave of nausea, real and profound, washed over me. The dark satisfaction I had felt before was gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying dread. This was no longer a game of chess. This was Russian roulette. And I had just spun the chamber. I drank my own tea, the safe tea, but it offered no comfort. All I could think about was the concentrated poison now coursing through her veins. What had I done? The question screamed in the silent corners of my mind. I had wanted justice, not a brutal, accelerated execution. The effects were not long in coming. Less than an hour later, Chloe abruptly stood up, a hand pressed to her mouth. She swayed, her eyes wide with panic and confusion. I don't feel well, she mumbled, her words slurred. I think I need to lie down. She took a stumbling step towards the hallway, and then her knees buckled. She crumpled to the floor. Not in a faint, but in a heap, conscious but barely. She was gasping for air, her skin taking on a grayish hue. For a moment, I was paralyzed. My plan had not included this. Not here. Not now. Not like this. The image of her on the rug was too close to the one in my vision of the future, but it was too soon. Mark wasn't home. There were no sirens. No paramedics. There was only me. My mind raced. If I called 911 now, they would take us both. They would run tests. They would find the digitalis in her system. But they would also question me. Why hadn't I called a doctor sooner? Why did she collapse in my home? The focus would be on her sudden, unexplained illness. My carefully constructed narrative of my own slow decline would be shattered. I had to get her up. I had to get her back to her room. "Chloe," I said, my voice sharp, cutting through my own panic. I went to her, kneeling on the rug. Her skin was cold and clammy. "Chloe, get up. You have to get up." She looked at me, her eyes unfocused, filled with a terrifying mix of pain and bewilderment. "Help me," she whispered. "I can't breathe." Summoning a strength I didn't know I possessed, I hooked my arms under hers and pulled. She was a dead weight, but my adrenaline-fueled fear was a powerful force. I dragged her, inch by agonizing inch, out of the living room and towards the stairs. It was a grotesque, nightmarish struggle. The silent, dying woman and the silent, murdering one, locked in a desperate embrace. This was the midpoint, the moment where the plan spun wildly out of my control. I was no longer just a puppeteer pulling strings from the shadows. I was on the stage, covered in sweat and fear, desperately trying to shove my collapsing marionette back behind the curtain before the audience arrived. Getting Chloe up the grand, curving staircase was a Herculean task. Each step was a battle against her dead weight and my own screaming muscles. She moaned, a low, guttural sound of pure misery, her head lolling against my shoulder. The scent of her expensive perfume was mixed with the sour smell of sickness and fear. It was the smell of my victory, and it was nauseating. I half-dragged, half-carried her into the master bedroom she shared with Mark, and let her fall onto the pristine, white duvet. She curled into a fetal position, her breathing ragged and shallow. Her eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, were now glassy with pain and confusion. She looked at me, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. Was it hatred? Pleading? Or just the vacant stare of a body shutting down? "What's happening to me?" she whispered, the words barely audible. I stood over her, breathing heavily, my own heart pounding not from poison, but from exertion and terror. I had to choose my words carefully. They had to be part of the performance. "You've been overdoing it, dear," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I smoothed a stray strand of hair from her damp forehead. The gesture was meant to look maternal, caring. It felt ghoulish. "You've completely run yourself down. You need to rest." She closed her eyes, either accepting my lie or too weak to question it. I left her there, closing the bedroom door softly behind me. I leaned against the cool wood of the door, my body trembling uncontrollably. My neat, orderly plan had devolved into chaos. The calculated, intellectual exercise of revenge had become a messy, physical reality of dragging a dying woman up a flight of stairs. This was no longer a game of chess. It was a brawl in a dark alley. I went downstairs and cleaned up the tea things, my hands shaking so badly that the cups rattled on the saucers. I washed them, dried them, and put them back in the china cabinet, erasing all evidence of the afternoon's ritual. I looked around the living room. Everything was in its place. The pillows were fluffed. The books were squared away. There was no sign of the struggle that had just occurred. It was as if it had never happened. When Mark came home an hour later, I was in my armchair, reading, the picture of domestic tranquility. "Where's Chloe?" he asked, shrugging off his coat. "She wasn't feeling well, dear," I said, looking up with practiced concern. "She had a bit of a turn after lunch. I think she has a fever." I convinced her to go lie down. He rushed upstairs, I heard the murmur of his concerned voice, and Chloe's weak, monosyllabic replies. He came down a few minutes later, his face etched with worry. "She looks terrible," he said, running a hand through his hair. "She's burning up, but her hands are like ice. And she's complaining of chest pains. I'm calling Dr. Miller." "That's a good idea," I said, my voice calm. This was the narrative I needed. Mark, the worried husband, taking charge. Chloe, the sick wife, under a doctor's care. Me, the frail mother-in-law, a concerned but helpless bystander. The next few days were a blur of hushed phone calls, doctor's visits, and a deepening gloom that settled over the house. Dr. Miller was perplexed. Chloe's blood tests had come back with anomalies. Her potassium levels were off. Her EKG showed arrhythmias that were highly unusual for a healthy woman her age. He prescribed bed rest and ordered more tests, muttering about viral infections and rare autoimmune disorders. He never once mentioned poison. The idea was too outlandish, too melodramatic for the quiet, orderly world of suburban medicine. Chloe was now confined to her bed. The role of caretaker had officially been reversed. Now it was Mark who brought her meals on a tray, who fluffed her pillows, who sat by her bedside, his face a study in helpless love. And it was I who now made the tea. "To soothe your stomach," I would tell her, bringing a single cup to her room. It was simple, harmless chamomile. She was too weak to protest, too sick to do anything but swallow what was given to her. The daily dose of poison had stopped. I had administered enough. Now, I just had to wait for the accumulation in her system to run its course. But something had changed in her. She would watch me as I moved about the room, her eyes following my every move. The vacant confusion was gone, replaced by a cold, dawning awareness. The fear was still there, but it was now mingled with something else, suspicion. The turning point, the final plot point before the endgame, came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I brought her tea and a small plate of toast. Mark was at work. We were alone. She pushed herself up against the pillows, her face gaunt but her gaze sharp. "I don't want it," she said, her voice a hoarse rasp. "You need to drink something, dear," I said gently. "It will help you feel better." "No," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Every time I have that tea, I feel worse. Started when we came here. With your tea." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I kept my expression placid. "Don't be silly, Chloe. It's just chamomile. Mark bought it himself." Which was true. I had asked him to pick up a new box a week ago. She shook her head. A slow, deliberate movement. "There was always something else in it. Something you put in it." The accusation hung in the air between us, sharp and glittering as a shard of glass. The pretense was over. The masks were off. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice level. "I think the fever is making you delirious." She tried to laugh, but it came out as a choking cough. "Delirious? No. I'm seeing things clearly for the first time. You've been poisoning me." She said the words, and the reality of them seemed to give her a surge of strength. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "You hate me. You've hated me since the day I married Mark. You want me out of his life." The audacity of it, the sheer, twisted hypocrisy, was breathtaking. She was projecting her own crime onto me. It was a brilliant, desperate move. "That's a terrible thing to say," I said, my voice soft with feigned hurt. "It's the truth." She insisted, trying to sit up straighter. But the effort was too much. She fell back against the pillows, gasping for breath, a sheen of sweat on her forehead. The poison still held dominion over her body. You won't get away with this," she panted. "Mark will see. He'll see what you are." I looked at her. This broken, malevolent creature lying in my son's bed. My plan had been to let her collapse, to let the doctors find the truth, to let the evidence speak for itself. But her accusation had changed the equation. She was going to fight back, to twist the narrative, to paint me as the villain. I stood there for a long moment, the teacup still in my hand. Then I made a decision. I placed the cup on her nightstand. "You're right," I said, my voice no longer soft or frail. It was the voice of Eleanor Vance, the historian, the survivor. Cold, clear, and precise. "You are seeing things clearly. You just have the roles reversed." Her eyes widened, the last vestiges of color draining from her face. "You thought I was a foolish old woman," I continued, stepping closer to the bed. "You thought I wouldn't notice my own life ebbing away, day by day, in a teacup. You thought my heart would just quietly give out, and no one would be the wiser. You are not a student of history, Chloe. People have been trying that trick for centuries. It rarely ends well for the poisoner." The realization dawned in her eyes, a slow, creeping wave of absolute horror. It was more terrifying than any fever, any pain. It was the intellectual certainty of her own doom. She had been outwitted, outplayed. "The tea," she whispered, her voice cracking. You switched the cups." "Every single day," I confirmed, my voice a merciless whisper. "Every time you turned your back. Every time you thought you were pushing me closer to the grave. You were digging your own. The poison in your veins. Chloe, that's your own special blend. You have no one to blame but yourself." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. But no sound came out. The truth was a poison more potent than any digitalis. It was paralyzing her from the inside out. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the terrible, irreversible knowledge of what I had done, and what she had done to herself. The game was over. All that was left was the checkmate, the confession, or rather, the revelation, hung in the house like a storm cloud, ready to break. Chloe's knowing silence was 1,000 times more unnerving than her false sweetness had ever been. When Mark was home, she was quiet and withdrawn, her eyes constantly darting towards me with a mixture of terror and pure, unadulterated hatred. When we were alone, she simply stared, her gaze a physical weight. The power dynamic had been inverted completely. She was my prisoner, and the house was her cell. I knew it couldn't last. Her body was failing, and her mind was now armed with the horrifying truth. It was a volatile, unsustainable situation. The endgame had to be now. I was no longer in control of the timing. Her body's final betrayal would dictate the schedule. It happened 2 days later. Mark had insisted we try to have a normal family dinner together. He thought it might lift Chloe's spirits. He carried her downstairs, a painful echo of my own secret struggle on the same staircase, and settled her into a chair at the grand dining table. She looked like a ghost at the feast, a fragile doll propped up against the dark, carved wood. She hadn't spoken a word to me in 48 hours. The meal was a tense, miserable affair. Mark tried to make cheerful conversation, talking about a new project at his firm, a joke a colleague had told. His words fell into the thick silence like stones into a well. I pushed food around my plate, playing the part of the concerned matriarch. Chloe didn't even lift her fork. She just sat there, her shallow breaths the only sound she made, her eyes fixed on me. "Chloe, honey, you should try to eat something," Mark urged gently, his voice laced with desperation. She turned her head slowly, as if the effort was monumental, and looked at her husband. Single, perfect tear welled in her eye and traced a path down her waxy cheek. "Mark," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "She did this to me." Mark froze, a forkful of mashed potatoes halfway to his mouth. What? What are you talking about?" "Your mother," Chloe breathed, her trembling finger lifting to point at me. She's been poisoning me. All this time. She wants me dead. The accusation, the one I had anticipated, was finally out. Mark stared at her, then at me, his face a canvas of utter confusion and disbelief. Chloe, what are you saying? That's insane. Mom is sick. You're sick. Maybe the stress is just. No, she cried, a sudden surge of adrenaline giving her voice a shocking strength. She tried to push herself up from the chair. She told me. She admitted it. She switched the teacups. The poison she thinks I was giving her. She's been giving it to me. It was a masterful final gambit. A deathbed confession, twisted to paint her as the victim of a jealous, murderous old woman. For a split second, I saw a flicker of doubt in Mark's eyes. His love for this woman, his instinct to believe her, was a powerful force. This was the moment my entire, terrible plan could unravel. But her body had its own timeline. The effort of her outburst was too much. Her face contorted in a grimace of agony. Her hand flew to her chest, clutching at the fabric of her silk blouse. Terrible, strangled gasp escaped her lips, and then she pitched forward, her head hitting the edge of the dining table with a sickening thud before she slid from her chair and crumpled onto the floor. This time, there was no dragging her into the shadows. This time, the collapse was public. Chloe! Mark screamed, leaping from his chair and falling to his knees beside her. He turned her over. Her eyes were rolled back in her head, her lips a ghastly blue. She wasn't breathing. The scene snapped into a horrifyingly familiar focus. This was it. The moment from the beginning. The vision that had been both my guide and my nightmare. As Mark fumbled with his phone, his hand shaking too badly to dial 911 correctly on the first try, I stood up. My movements were calm, deliberate. I walked to the sideboard where I kept a small, locked box. I used a key I wore on a chain around my neck and opened it. Inside was the small, leather-bound journal. I took it out, along with the plastic bag containing the original test strip and several others I had managed to collect from her safe cups of tea over the weeks. Mark was shouting into the phone, his voice cracking with hysteria. My wife has collapsed. She's not breathing. Please, hurry. I walked over to him. I didn't kneel. I stood, looking down at the woman on the floor. The woman who had tried to steal my life, my son, my home. I felt nothing. No pity. No triumph. Just a vast, cold emptiness. The war was over. The sirens began their distant wail. A sound that was now as familiar to me as the ticking of the grandfather clock. Mark was attempting clumsy CPR, counting compressions through his sobs. Come on, Chloe. Breathe. Please. By the time the paramedics burst through the door, the scene was one of pure chaos and tragedy. They took over immediately, their movements a whirlwind of professional efficiency. They hooked her up to monitors, administered shocks with a defibrillator, and worked desperately to bring her back. Mark was pulled away, stumbling back against a wall, his face buried in his hands. He was utterly broken. I waited until the lead paramedic, a grim-faced man with tired eyes, paused to look at the flat line on his monitor. I stepped forward into the organized chaos. I held out the evidence I had so carefully collected. The journal. The plastic bags with the dated test strips. I believe you will find she has acute digitalis toxicity, I said, my voice cutting through the noise. It was the same line I had rehearsed in my mind, the same line that began this story. She was poisoning my tea. I have been switching the cups for the past 3 months. The paramedic stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. Mark lifted his head, his face streaked with tears, his eyes wide with a horror that was beyond comprehension. He was looking at me as if for the first time. Not as his mother, not as a frail old woman, but as a stranger. Cold, calculating stranger who had just confessed to a slow, methodical killing in the middle of her own living room. You should test her. I continued, my voice unwavering. I think you'll find everything you need. I handed him the journal. And you will want to read this. It's a detailed account. They loaded Chloe onto a gurney. There was no rush now. The flat line on the monitor told its own story. As they wheeled her out of the house, a white sheet pulled up to her chin. Mark finally spoke. His voice was a hollow whisper, fragile as glass. Mom, what have you done? I looked at my son, my only child, the center of my world, and I saw in his eyes that the woman he had known as his mother was gone, replaced by the monster his wife had always claimed I was. I had won. I had survived. But I had just lost the one thing in the world I had been trying to protect. The aftermath was a quiet, sterile affair, a stark contrast to the turbulent emotions of the preceding months. The police came, their presence an official violation of the home's deep-seated privacy. They were polite, professional, but their eyes held a stunned curiosity as they listened to my calm, methodical account. I handed over my journal, the remaining test kits, and told them about the small, discreet security camera I had installed in the living room, focused on the tea table. I had activated it the day I decided to fight back. The footage would corroborate everything. They took my statement in the dining room, at the very table where Chloe had made her final, desperate accusation. Mark was questioned separately in the study, his late father's sanctuary. I could not hear his words, but I could feel his anguish through the thick, old walls of the house. He was a man whose entire reality had been shattered in the space of an evening. He had lost his wife, and in the same breath, he had lost the mother he thought he knew. I was not arrested. My story, supported by the meticulous evidence I had gathered, painted a clear picture of self-defense, an unusual, protracted, and chilling case of self-defense, but self-defense nonetheless. The district attorney would later refer to it as the most unique and disturbing case of justifiable action he had ever seen. Chloe's digital footprint revealed searches for tasteless poisons, herbs that mimic heart failure, and lethal doses of foxglove. She had purchased the digitalis extract from a shady online source using a burner credit card. She had sealed her own fate long before I ever switched a single cup. Legally, I was in the clear. After the police left, a profound and heavy silence descended upon the house. It was a silence filled with ghosts and unspoken words. Mark emerged from the study. He didn't look at me. He walked to the front door like a man in a trance. Mark? I said, my voice sounding small in the vastness of the hall. He stopped, his hand on the doorknob, but he did not turn. I'm going to a hotel, he said, his voice flat, hollowed out. I need to think. This is your home, I said softly. He finally turned, and the look on his face was a wound from which I knew I would never recover. It was not anger. It was not hatred. It was a deep, soul-shattering confusion and a profound sense of alienation. He was looking at a stranger who wore his mother's face. Is it? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know what this place is anymore. I don't know who you are. He opened the door and walked out into the night, leaving me alone in the silent, cavernous house. The days that followed were empty. Mark did not come back. He sent a moving company to collect his and Chloe's belongings. I watched from the upstairs window as two strangers packed up the remnants of my son's life, loading boxes into a truck. They removed the designer clothes from the closets, the expensive gadgets from the nightstands, the photographs of a smiling couple that had been alive from the very beginning. The house felt lighter, cleaner, but achingly empty. My old routine returned, but it was a hollow echo of what it once was. I woke with the sun, drank my coffee, and walked through the silent rooms. But the peace was gone. The house was no longer a sanctuary of cherished memories. It was a crime scene. Every corner held a new echo, a new ghost. The armchair where I sat was where I plotted. The living room rug was where she had collapsed. The grand staircase was where I had dragged her dying body. My victory had poisoned the very air I breathed. My friend Linda called. She had heard the whispers that were surely circulating through the small, gossipy town of Concord. "Eleanor? Is it true?" she asked, her voice a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. "It's true," I said simply. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "My God," she finally breathed. "Are you all right?" The question was absurd. Was I all right? I was alive. I was not in prison. But I was not all right. "I'm surviving, Linda," I said. It was the most honest answer I could give. Weeks turned into a month. The autumn leaves finished their fall, leaving the trees outside my window like stark, skeletal fingers against a gray sky. Winter was coming. One afternoon, at 3 o'clock, I found myself in the kitchen. On a whim, I filled the kettle and put it on the stove to boil. I opened the china cabinet and took out a single teacup, one of the blue floral ones. I placed a bag of simple chamomile tea inside and poured the hot water over it. I carried the single cup into the living room and sat in my armchair. The afternoon sun, weak and watery, slanted through the windows, illuminating the dancing dust motes. I looked at the empty chair across from me. I had won the war. I had defeated the enemy. I had protected my home and my life with a ruthlessness I never knew I possessed. I had uncovered the truth hidden behind a perfect facade, and I had served a cold, final justice. But what was the cost of that victory? Mark called me once. His voice was distant, formal. He told me he was moving to the West Coast, taking a job with a firm in Seattle. A new start. A continent away from the memories of this house. "I understand," I said. "I'll call," he promised. But his tone held no conviction. We both knew it was a lie. Final, polite severing of a cord that had become hopelessly entangled and stained. I lifted the teacup to my lips. The steam was warm against my skin. I was safe. I was free. I was the sole mistress of this grand, historic house, the guardian of my family's legacy. I had everything I had fought for. But as I sat there, alone in the crushing silence, I knew the truth. Chloe, in the end, had succeeded in a way she never intended. She had taken my son from me. She had turned my sanctuary into a prison of memory. She had wanted to leave me alone in this house, a frail old woman waiting to die. And in a way, she had. I took a sip of the tea. It tasted of nothing but solitude.